As we disembarked from the cars on that Sunday morning, July 21st, 1861, the distant booming of cannon fell upon our cars, and we realized that now we were indeed on the fiery edge of battle. We had orders to cast off our knapsacks that we might march unimpeded to the field. Leaving them in a pile by the roadside under a small guard, we were soon marching at the double quick for Manassas. Our pulses beat more quickly than our feet as we passed on, the sounds of battle waxing nearer and nearer every moment. It was a severe test of endurance, for the field was 6 miles away, and the heat of that July day was very exhausting. The weather had been very dry, and the dust rose in clouds around us as we double-quicked on. So thick was it that I distinctly remember I could not see my file leader. We were by and by near enough to hear the rattle of the musketry, and soon we began to meet the wounded coming off the field in streams, some limping along, some on stretchers borne by their comrades. Stern work was evidently right ahead of us, and it did not steady our nerves for our first battle to be told, as the wounded told us, especially those whose wounds were slight, that it was going very badly with our men at the front. At length, the dreadful 6-mile double-quick march was over, and the firing line was right in front of us. Some few, very few, had dropped out exhausted. All of us were nearly spent with the heat and the dust and the killing pace, and a brief halt was made to get breath, moisten our lips from the canteens, and prepare for the charge. I remember how poor Sel Brogdon, panting and exhausted, turned to me and asked for a drink of water from my canteen. I had scarcely a swallow left, but he was so much worse off than I, and his appeal was so piteous that I gave him the last drop. We had arrived on the field in the nick of time at the very crisis when victory or defeat was trembling in the balance. The Federal General, McDowell, had turned General Beauregard's flank, and only General Joe Johnston's timely arrival on that flank of the Confederate position had saved him from disaster. Jackson, at the head of his Virginia troops, standing like a stone wall. Those were the words of General B as he sought to rally his retreating South Carolinians. But the Confederate line was wavering, and the result of the day hung in grave doubt when Elzey's brigade arrived on the field and deployed for attack. Of this brigade, the leading regiment, the one first on the field, was the 1st Maryland, under Colonel Stewart, and it was the blow struck by this fine body of men, 600 strong, that turned the balance of battle in favor of the Southern Army. Looking back now, I think the moral effect of the great cloud of dust which rose as we double-quicked to the field, and which was easily seen by the Federals, was worth quite as much as our 600 muskets in action. For it gave the enemy the impression that it was at least a brigade instead of a regiment that was being launched against them at the moment of our charge. This was intensified by the shout, "Go in, Baltimore," which rose above the din of battle as we swept forward. It so happened that the same Massachusetts regiment, which was so roughly handled by the people in the streets of Baltimore on the 19th of April, was in our front on the 21st of July, and prisoners afterwards told us that when we charged, the Massachusetts men said, "Here come those D.D. Baltimore men. It's time for us to get up and get." Then, after the day was won, and General Elzey, our brigade commander, was saluted as the Blucher of the day, we men of the 1st Maryland were proud to say that our regiment was the head of the spear that Elzey drove into the vitals of the enemy that eventful day. I remember that after the first rush, when a brief pause came, some of us dashed down to a tiny little brook for a mouthful of water, only to find the water tinged with blood. Nevertheless, not a few stooped and lapped it up where it was clearest. The first man I saw fall in the battle was General Kirby Smith, who was riding by the side of our column before we deployed for the charge. He fell in the most spectacular way. The reins falling from his grasp, he reeled in the saddle, threw out his arms, and fell to the ground, seriously but not fatally wounded. The New York Zouaves, in their red breeches, were deployed as skirmishers in our front and did us some damage before we formed our line. One of the amusing incidents that occurred, and the Confederate soldier was always eager to see some fun in the serious work of war, was when George Lemon, in his excitement, fired his musket too close to Nick Watkins' head and shot a hole in his cap, fortunately not in his head, and Nick turned and said, in the coolest way, "George Lemon, I wish you'd look where you're shooting. I'm not a Yankee." How well I remember our eager expectancy that night. We had seen the rout and had followed the fleeing Federals some distance along the road back towards Washington. It was full of the evidences of the panic into which the Union Army had been thrown. I need not describe a scene so often described before, but with all the evidences of the demoralization of our enemy, we were confident they could be pursued and Washington taken, if the Confederate Army pressed on. This we confidently expected, and were bitterly disappointed when the next day and the next came and went without any serious advance. As I lay down to sleep on the battlefield that night, I had much to think of. The weariness of the day and the peril of the battle were lost sight of in the awful scenes of death and suffering to which we had been introduced that day for the first time. I had seen the reality of the battlefield, its carnage, its desolation, its awful pictures of the wounded, the dying, and the dead. Somehow, I was especially moved by the sight of the battery horses on the Henry Hill, so frightfully torn by shot and shell. The sufferings of the poor brutes, not in their own battle or by their own fault, but for man's sake, appealed to me in a peculiar way. Mingled with my devout thankfulness for my own safety was my sorrow as news came in of friend after friend, and some relatives, too, who had fallen. It was reported all over Virginia that I had been among the killed. One of my cousins, Colonel Randolph Harrison, when he saw me, exclaimed, "Why, I thought you were dead." These unfounded reports were often the occasion of much needless distress to the relatives of the men in the field.
If you enjoyed today's video and would like to see more content like this, be sure to take a shot at the like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest BirdDogg content. And if you'd like to support the channel, for a limited time there's exclusive Civil War Diaries merchandise available in the video link below.